Welcome back to the Global Report. I'm here again with Bill Lawrence, Professor Extraordinaire. um, it's nice to see you again, and we're back here today to pick up on a subject we talked about in our first episode, was the ongoing conflict in Gaza. And you've sort of been tracking this, doing a lot of interviews, so I thought it would be a good time to loop back with you and really get the synopsis and the breakdown and the rundown of what's going on. And especially today, we've seen it really trickle into the United States and domestic politics, and it's having an impact on local college campuses here in Massachusetts, down in DC, in New York, all over the country. We're seeing impacts and feeling the impacts domestically. So I think it's a good time to pick this back up. And I think we'll start sort of touching upon what is the ground situation in Rafah. And we'll talk about that mostly because from the get-go, there was sort of this acknowledgement by Israel that they were going to try and weed out Hamas completely. And part of that meant going into Rafah, sort of this seen as a stronghold and sort of a hiding spot for members of Hamas who were responsible for carrying out the attacks in October 7th. So Israel has sort of been hell-bent on going into Rafah. There's been sort of a red line from the international community on trying to prevent that situation because of the issue with civilian casualties and all the other spillover effects. So what is the situation currently in Rafah, and how did we get here today?
Yeah, I think I agree with you. It's a really important time to do this. And I know you and I had 2 or 3 other topics we were hoping to do first, but because so much is happening right now, and because I'm so close to some of the newsmakers around these issues, I thought, and you agreed that this is just a good time to dip back in and take a look at what's going on. You also reminded me when you started of Alexi Lalas's soccer podcast, State of the Union, where everybody's extraordinaire. The way he says it, it's really funny. You should watch the intro sometime to all of his podcasts. But I think we should start by saying that the U.S. Very, very much did not want Israel to go into Rafah. And the assessment, both of the policy side and the intelligence side of the U.S. government, which don't always agree, was that there was no way to do it properly because of the 1.4 million people that had been pushed into this tiny town of 300,000 people by the previous operations in Gaza. The famine that, according to Cindy McCain of the World Food Program and others, has already started and is moving from the north to the south, that all of the conditions were so catastrophic, there was no way to have an operation in Rafah that didn't make things worse rather than better, including for Hamas. So that's the consensus of the U.S. government and the U.S. intelligence community and most of the experts who cover the Middle East. There's a lot of people who don't cover the region closely or read the intelligence and the insider sort of accounts of what's going on, who think if we just finish the job and we just hit Hamas hard enough, Hamas goes away and this never happens again. But if you looked carefully over the weekend at all of the interviews, including Tony Blinken's couple of interviews on the Sunday shows, and all of the other proper reporting and assessments, Hamas is back everywhere. They're back in the north, they're back in the middle, and they're back in the south. And this gets back to the old adage, you can't have a military strategy without a political strategy. Israel has a military strategy without a political strategy. If you don't have a political strategy, you're just going to have to keep fighting and fighting and fighting forever. There's no way to win without winning politically, ultimately. And to call out the other side, we've been having this ridiculous contention coming from Hamas and its backers and most of the countries of the UN and many others that somehow there's such thing as a permanent ceasefire. There's no such thing as a permanent ceasefire. It's called a cease treaty or an armistice or something. Yeah, and I've been calling everyone's bluff and saying, well, if you want a permanent ceasefire, then how about a peace treaty? Guess what? Neither Hamas nor Israel want a peace treaty. They don't want an armistice, and they don't want a permanent ceasefire. And so this whole fight over a permanent ceasefire, not only does the concept not exist, in international affairs, it can't happen, because Hamas wants a permanent state of war against Israel to liberate the whole territory, and Israel wants a permanent state of war against the Palestinians. And if you don't believe me, just look at what they say and look at what they do. They want constant war with the Palestinians. There's no question in my mind. And it's one of the reasons Netanyahu last Monday overruled his entire war cabinet that wanted this ceasefire and said, no, we keep going. Now, Netanyahu has its own reasons to continue the war, personal political reasons, but there's also a logic to the right-wing Israeli position that Netanyahu's going with this, which is, if they're going to fight us forever, we're going to fight them forever. And everybody believes behind closed doors, if not publicly, that Hamas can't be defeated for many reasons, including that Hamas is in about 5 countries. They're growing in popularity in the West Bank. They're in Lebanon. They're everywhere. So what do you mean by defeating? They have tunnels out to Egypt. They can go there anytime they want. Even if Egypt shuts down all the tunnels, which they did several years ago, more will be dug. So this idea that somehow you can defeat Hamas without replacing Hamas is what's wrong. And that's why the U.S. has been saying, once we have a plan, like a day after plan, that's when you start negotiating with Hamas about negotiating themselves out of power. And nobody noticed, except the people watching really closely, but Hamas already agreed to leave, their leadership to leave, already agreed to hand over Gaza to the Palestinian Authority or some hybrid new government not called Hamas. So they've already made the major concessions that Israel says they're trying to force through military action. But Israel refused the deal, right? So here we are. The war's continuing. I think the best metaphor I've heard of what's going on in Rafah right now, where 360,000 people have been forced out. And these aren't just 360,000 families with, horse-drawn carts trucking over to another town. These are 360,000 children, thousands of orphans whose parents were already killed in the conflict, tens of thousands, probably over 100,000 injured people, many of whom just can't move, people starving, people with nothing left, people with literally the clothes on their back and diseases that they're getting because of these horrible conditions, being told to move to a beach where the conditions, there's already 450,000 people there and there's nowhere for them to go. And the people in the north are being told to go south. The people in the south are being told to go north, and everybody's going west to the beach and there's nothing there for them. And it's just disgusting conditions. So, if anyone thinks, oh, well, they can just move this 1.4 million people and be done with Hamas, you're smoking something.
Right.
So we're at the point now where, unfortunately, most people have realized the U.S. just has to stop this war, like they did in 2021, like they did in 2014, like they did in 2012, like they did in 2009, like they did in 2008. With all the previous Israel wars with Gaza, where the U.S. had to stop it, and this one went longer because the October 7 attacks were so much more atrocious. But the U.S. just has to stop this. So the best metaphor I've heard about Rafah, and I'll make this my last point on Rafah, is a friend of mine who said as they started to go in, Israel's gone from sort of being forced not to do a major military action by the United States, which they claim they're still following that advice, to doing a salami slice major military action, right? So it started with 100,000, then it was 100 and something thousand, then it was 300,000, today it was 360,000. So they're just cutting slices of Rafah population, trying to force out people that can move, which isn't enough of them, bombing the others that are still there, and starting to mobilize forces to go in and look for guys that, frankly, the Hamas fighters that are there, they're either choosing to fight with them at choke points or particular locations, or they've already left. So there isn't really a clearing operation to do. It's just a mass mobilization of civilians so that Netanyahu can claim he finished the job.
Yeah, I think what's so troublesome about the whole situation, in terms of the talking points and pundits and so forth, and we try to turn this hyper complicated conflict into sort of these black and white talking points. And I think a lot of the pro-Israel discussions I'm hearing are, well, they need to get in, they need to finish the job. And it's like, what job are you finishing?
Yeah.
You know, what's your goal? What are you
Yeah.
ultimately trying to achieve?
Yeah.
And early on in the conflict, I believe it was Fareed Zakaria on his podcast, GPS, was sort of creating this analogous reference to what the U.S. did after 9/11. It sort
Yeah.
of put the blinders on, and it started to view the world in a very black and white, and us versus them. And we went in and we attempted to do things, and we achieved certain things, right? But what ended up happening is we radicalized a much broader population, a regional population. We created more enemies than we defeated at the end of the day, and we ended up dealing with much greater consequences for the next 15, 20 years with the creation of other organizations that we ended up doing a lot more harm than good. And so I think we're seeing some of that with what's going on here. Israel's got the blinders on, is sort of failing to understand what the long-term consequences are going to be. And that's going to be a serious challenge. And the lack of humanity with which they're treating these people, um, again, they're looking at it through a black and white lens. They've forgotten about what it means to treat people with dignity and respect. Let's throw out the complication of the war piece. As you're saying, right? Even if their argument was true, they're still not behaving in such a way and acting in such a way that is becoming of what they should be doing. So um, I think you hit the nail on the head with sort of what you're discussing. And I think in 6 months to a year's time, there's going to be this period in which we look back and say it was ridiculous not to have had the ceasefire much earlier than what we end up seeing. So
So
um,
you're right in many ways. Just to sort of throw some facts and data points under what you're saying, we're creating an entire generation of Palestinian terrorists by supporting the extreme agony of killing. I personally know people that have lost 70 family members. Like the agony of that. Imagine it being in their shoes. And then Biden was smart enough to point this out relatively early on, and he's kept to his guns. And what he's talking about is falling on deaf ears in Israel, where about 70% of Israelis still support finishing the job in Rafah and finishing the war, except if you look carefully at the polls, they also say they don't trust Netanyahu. About 60% of them say he's prolonging the war for his own personal benefit. And I think 60 to 70% of Israelis say they don't want to uh, um, uh, do the war in this way if it breaks the relationship with the United States, which it's starting to do. So they're starting to figure out, and Biden's popularity rating in Israel is way higher than Netanyahu's, to the point that I think Richard Haas, of the former head of Council on Foreign Relations, was saying about a month or two ago, Biden just needs to go to Israel and talk to the Knesset the way Netanyahu did during the Obama administration. Just say, look, you've got to stop, guys. We went through this. We did it all wrong, along the lines of what you were just talking about.
right.
And since you didn't name it, let's just say it. There are a lot of conspiracy theories out there that the U.S. created ISIS on purpose, right? It
Mhm.
did not. But the U.S. did create ISIS, and I
Right.
could sit here
Right.
and talk for 5 or 10 minutes about how the U.S. inadvertently created ISIS, and then they took over land in about 10 countries, and we're still fighting them in about 3 or 4. And there's vestigial aspects of them in all 10 of those countries, and it's another generational fight against an organization that didn't even exist until we broke Iraq, de-Baathified, and then pushed all the Baathists, former Saddam guys, into ISIS along with the Islamic radicals, and then created our own enemy. So all that to say that we should have learned the lesson. We should know better. It's too late for the 35,000 dead Palestinians, of which 16,000 the U.S. and Israel have admitted were civilians that did need to die, and another 10,000 or so still buried under the rubble. It's too late for those people. It's too late for the over 100,000 that are injured. It's officially 80,000, I think, but it's much higher. But it's not too late for the 2 million Palestinians that are still alive. I think we've killed and injured about 5% of Gaza, but there's the 95% of Gaza that's still suffering but alive. And there's an Israeli population that needs to live in safety. There's a world population that's tired of Israelis and Palestinians fighting, and all the terrorism that it spawns, and gives justifications for in the Islamic world. The world will be at a better place when we stop letting these cycles, these orgies of violence occur. And right now, I'm proud of the U.S. After Israel dropped a few hundred of these 2,000-pound bombs that wipe out entire blocks full of civilians. We stopped the delivery of 3,500 of these 2,500-pound bombs that we didn't use in Mosul. We don't use those in urban environments, but the Israelis have decided the bunker busters are just fine for the most crowded place on earth, Gaza. And that just, the Biden administration's done unprecedented things. They've put sanctions on settlers. They've put de facto sanctions on troops. They've forced open 3 humanitarian crossings. They've forced in tons of humanitarian assistance, although it barely reaches half of what's needed at the best of times. They've withheld the bombs. They stopped sharing intelligence for Rafah, and another 10 things I could list. So even though from a Palestinian perspective, those are all drops in the bucket and useless, from an American-Israeli perspective, the U.S. has finally started to say this has got to end very, very soon, because everything Israel's doing is making things worse.
Well, I think what you just touched upon also highlights sort of this confusion of responsibility and commitment on part of the U.S. We talk about trying to do things right, trying to get the Israelis to do what is right, but we are also arming them relentlessly and sort of signing blank checks, for lack of a better term. And so that's created an enormous response here in the U.S. We're seeing it on college campuses, this disruption of classes, and so forth, to demonstrate on behalf of the Palestinian cause, with severe frustration with what the U.S. government is doing as a whole, and sort of this unrelenting support for Israel and a defense of Israel. How do you split the two? How do you justify the U.S. supporting Israel, but also trying to take a position of doing what's right in the long term, doing what's right on a day-to-day basis with what we're seeing in Gaza?
To the whole world, it looks incoherent and chaotic. To Americans, it looks like a middle role that's angering both sides. Biden's getting it from both sides now, just like presidents of universities are getting it from both sides now. Whatever they do, they're wrong by a subset of the community. And so I think as I've said before in this podcast, when I get confused about policy, one of my main metrics is what policy will protect the most powerless people in this situation? What policy protects those people? And if my policy is protecting those people, my policy recommendation is protecting those people, then I know I'm on the right track. And that's everybody. Everybody needs to be protected here. Israelis, Palestinians, for and against on the campuses, you need policies that protect everybody. And then you're moving in the right direction. On the arms, one of the things I didn't mention is that the U.S. has not only held the 3,500 bombs, but they have withheld a number of other arms shipments that, among other things, are being slow walked. And there are certain arms shipments that were going all the way back to December the U.S. hasn't sent. So the U.S. started to have a change of heart in the December timeframe when we saw the initial catastrophe and massacres that were going on, and that's when the U.S. tone started to change. But we didn't really have a lot of actions the U.S. was taking until Rafah, until this red line or whatever you want to call it. U.S. has gone in and out of calling it a red line because it's a moving red line, but it's a massive dissatisfaction on the part of the U.S. when we had a deal. We had a deal that Israel agreed to. We had a deal that Hamas agreed to. Bill Burns negotiated it. It was solid. I've seen it. And Israel reneged on the deal because it wasn't politically expedient for Netanyahu and his right-wing coalition. In terms of the campus, and since you raised the issue, it's an issue I follow very close, done a lot of commentary on it. Here's how I view the whole thing. We had protests on about 200 college campuses in the U.S., according to Speaker Johnson. Assuming that's true, that's 15% of American four-year colleges with enrollments over 250 students, the ones covered in the U.S. news. That's a huge number of colleges. That's more than the divestment protests of the 80s and the anti-Vietnam War protests in that period of time. I don't think they even got to that many, even in the whole entire Vietnam War. They may have, but 15% is a huge number. I counted protests where I actually know the name of the university on about 120 campuses. I don't know the other 80 he was talking about, but it's hard to track this down nationwide, and the news aggregators don't do it well. Of which there were encampments on 80 campuses. There were arrests at 60 campuses of roughly 3,000 people. If you were a pro-Palestinian protest, you were about 4 times as much to be broken up and arrested than if you were a pro-Israel protest, which was about 10% of the protests were pro-Israel, about 90% were pro-Palestinian. You had a 4 times as likely chance to get arrested and injured if you were in a pro-Palestinian protest than if you were in a pro-Israeli protest. The worst case being at UCLA, where the LAPD watched for 4 hours while the thuggish pro-Israel protesters, funded in part by Jerry Seinfeld's wife, used sticks, metal bars, metal fencing, a scooter, firecrackers, mice, and loudspeakers with crying babies, and I'm forgetting something. They had something else, and started beating up protesters. Sent something like 15 to the hospital, and the LAPD watched for nearly 4 hours, to the point that Governor Newsom had to send in the California Highway Patrol the next day to break up the encampment, but also to control things because the LAPD didn't get the right orders, they said, and just watched a bloodbath. But I'm surprised somebody didn't get killed. It's just horrific to watch on film. So we had roughly 12 universities that. So most of the encampments have been broken up, and we have roughly 12 universities that made concessions. Evergreen College divested. Another 6 or 8 schools are doing what the protesters wanted, making their accounts, their investments in the Israeli war machine and the U.S. war machine supporting it, transparent and looking into divestment, and then of course a global set of protests that followed the U.S. in about 20 countries. That was quite dramatic. The way I view it is there's 3 sets of issues that weren't handled well by almost any university. There's a set of free speech issues, there's a set of safety issues, and the set of civil disobedience issues. On the safety issues, you were much more likely to be safe if you were pro-Israel, despite all the crying about anti-Semitism, than if you were pro-Palestinian. And by my count, 95 to 99% of the anti-Semitic comments were made off campus, not on campus, where students, Jewish Students for Peace, was one of the main organizers of the encampments, and they were holding Shabbat services and Sabbath Seder services, within these encampments, which was doing interfaith, and they had rules about what they said. But nonetheless, the U.S. just saw it as anti-Semitic. Time to send in the cops. I was on one show on Al Hora TV, which is U.S. government Arabic language TV, where Niall Gardner of Heritage, I believe, Foundation, the former Thatcher aide who wrote her book with her, said that all of the foreign students involved in these protests should be jailed and then deported. All of the U.S. students should be jailed. I was on with Jim Jeffrey, former ambassador to Iraq, who said that the student protesters were worse than Hamas. And I have yet to meet an on-campus student protester, and I talked to hundreds of faculty and students that were pro-Hamas, not one. So like there was that side of it. So this,
well, you had you had instigators who weren't even part of the student body, kind
from
of
the
showing
outside,
up,
and
that's what's so creepy. Is
and then
I
that
think
became
a lot of this.
Yeah, that became a talking point in right-wing media, that the outside instigators were controlling the students on campus. It was the exact opposite. Students on campus were pushing those guys out, right? The instigators, and then that became like everything that was going on. But just to finish on the three issues, I'll be quick. There was a set of free speech issues where the bias was very much towards one side. There was a set of safety issues, which I've covered, where the bias was very much towards one side. And then there's a set of civil disobedience issues, which I think that a lot of the students got wrong. Because if you want to break a window, if you want to take over a building, if you want to, like happened at my son's college, stop a campus tour by jumping in front of them, right? Then you deserve to be arrested. What I've been saying in my interviews is, Martin Luther King didn't cross the Edmund whatever bridge and then run. He crossed the bridge and then went to the proverbial Birmingham jail. You know what I mean? Like, if you want to do civil disobedience, then you should be willing to put your college status on the line, be suspended or expelled, be arrested. And although some universities treated the protesters a little bit with kids' gloves, and others were way too harsh, and a lot of others were in the middle, I don't think the students fully understood that civil disobedience is not the same as free speech.
Right.
So if you're going to break the law and be disruptive, and I'm not just talking about sitting in tents on one corner of the green and saying something, but I'm talking about stopping students from going to classes or making them feel unsafe, then you need to be controlled. The problem is that they were arresting people for doing that weren't doing it. So that was just unfair. And the last thing I'll say is a whole new generation of young people who will eventually be in leadership positions, because these are all politicized students, have now turned on support of Israel as a U.S. ally. And it's split the Jewish community, as I mentioned in our previous discussion on this, in fundamental ways. So I'm expecting over the long term a change in the U.S. policy towards Israel coming because of how badly the U.S. domestically and internationally handled things since October 7th.
Well, I think it'll also kind of hinge upon the broader geopolitical situation. I think the relationship and what goes on between the U.S. and Iran is an unfettered disaster. I think we've mismanaged that completely. Yep. And it's just gotten to a silly point almost. Yep. And I think a lot of that is because of Netanyahu. But
take, for example, like one of the many things we've been discussing just in the last week, the same Republicans that held up weapons to Israel for 18 months are now screaming bloody murder because the weapons aren't going to Israel instantaneously. You know what I mean? Like, it's just like the way in which people like Lindsey Graham can zig and zag on these issues, saying that nothing matters but the border until everything matters except the border. It's just hallucinatorily ridiculous. You know what I mean? Like, as you were saying, and there's so much hypocrisy in Washington on these issues.
Well, I think, part of that is also driven. I think there's a lot of shape shifting that's going to go on in sort of the broader geopolitical order. Yep. Like, we had all these traditional relationships and security apparatuses and vice versa. And everything is sort of moving on a day-to-day, almost week-to-week
Yep.
pace in a
Yep.
way that we really have not seen before. And so the US is having to like constantly adjust, and that feels to the American populace um, painful. I think having that amount of change and constant like confusion about what the US is and should be doing um, creates a lot of angst. And I think that's part of what's driving so much of the civil disobedience. I think there's also the fanning of the flame
Yep.
with social media going completely
Bonkers.
untethered and doing
Yep.
what it wants, right? And just
Yep.
driving up revenue and algorithms for viewership and
Yep.
addiction and vice versa. So
Can you tell me
I think
something as a young person? Why is it every other social media posting I see says destroy? Like if somebody argues with somebody and makes a good point, they've destroyed that person or killed them. Like the language people used to get eyeballs, is just like
I'm not even
it's like
up
open
anymore because
combat.
it
Yeah, yeah,
changes, every other day. I'm so lost. It's ridiculous. Um, but I think that's a challenge, right?
yeah,
I think people are so concerned about anti-Semitism,
yep,
like you're talking about, right? Jewish students were or pro-Israel students were much more likely to have not gotten arrested, to
yep,
had an easier time
yep,
protesting, even in peaceful situations.
yep,
Um, the reality is there's that danger of anti-Semitism making a serious comeback. And you have people like Vladimir Putin coming out and just being totally anti-Semitic with
yep,
everything that they're doing,
yep,
using those social media platforms to promote
yep,
conspiracies, to fan the flames, and
yep.
that's not going
They're all over our
addressed.
social
And
media, and on a daily basis, I talk to people that are just giving me Russian talking points and not even
yeah,
realizing that's where it comes
and
from, like
so
verbatim, verbatim.
how are students
Yeah,
who are just sort of in their nascent, right, um, opinion development stage? Because I
yeah,
truly believe you get into college at 18 to 22.
yeah.
Um, Contrary to popular belief, it's not this liberal indoctrination
No,
that going on at colleges.
no.
There's a serious opportunity for thought-provoking dialogue to
Yep,
really develop who you are, what you think, what you believe. And at the end of those 4 years, you are going to come out a different person than you went in when you were 18.
yep,
Um, you will hear different perspectives. You're going to meet different people, and you're going to be surrounded by things that you weren't used to.
yep.
And so,
If I could
at
say
the same
something,
time, if you're
if I can
getting
just,
fed junk during those 4 years,
yeah, yeah,
right,
yeah,
that's a challenge.
yeah. One thing I have noticed that is on the positive side in the last 10 years or so is that high schools are teaching critical thinking. They at least figure that part out. And I'm often shocked how much undergrads I talk to dismiss stupid stuff they see in social media and stupid stuff they hear on campus because they've been taught critical thinking. That really juices me sometimes. I'm like, my son too, like I'll point out stuff that even looked a little convincing to me or whatever, like I'll point it out, like, what do you think of this? And he's really quick to dismiss most of the bullshit out there,
Yeah.
in the social media space, because he has a trained eye.
Yeah, that's what's so
Yeah,
ironic
yeah,
about it
yeah,
is
yeah,
it's
yeah,
almost there's like this other side to the social media and all this,
yeah. Your generation
attempted, and
knows
it's
how
like
to
a
watch it.
bullshit meter. We
Yeah,
have this bullshit meter we've developed because we've been fed so
yeah.
much data and information.
And
It's
most
immediate.
of the J6ers were my age because they didn't have that skill set. You know what I mean? Like a lot of young people don't get duped the way the older generations do, and then they're worried the younger generations are getting duped when they aren't. If I could say a quick thing about anti-Semitism too, I think it was really interesting this week that the guy who wrote the Holocaust Museum anti-Semitism definition, which we're all using, which also is used to track that anti-Semitic attacks are 4 times up in the United States, but they're including in his definition that says criticism of Israel is anti-Semitism. And the guy who wrote the Holocaust Museum definition said, I never intended for my
Right.
definition, which was supposed to be educational, to become law, because criticism of Israel can be anti-Semitism. He never intended, nor should anyone say, that criticism of Israel is anti-Semitism. And that's the view now of most of the American right, most of the anti-defamation types of organizations, the pro-Israel lobby, campus campuses, universities, states in Maryland. I can't say something against Israel, or I can't get a federal contract. There are now anti-Semitism laws in about 30 U.S. states, and so one of the things this new generation is going to have to help us do over time is separate anti-Semitism, which is horrible and should be linked to to Islamophobia and anti-Arab and Palestinian sentiment, like when we see the Israeli ambassador at the UN saying that a Palestinian state is a terrorist state by definition, and that being acceptable up there in New York, in that community of supporters of his in New York, we have to be able to separate between criticism of countries and criticism of ethnic groups and religions. And we've just made that really mushy and muddy because of this misappropriation of the Holocaust Museum definition.
So I want to wrap up the episode and really talk about the ceasefire negotiations. We know they've sort of fallen through. What were you tracking going on in Cairo? What do you see as the next steps? Ultimately, what's going to get us to some sort of peace arrangement, or at least, some sort of ceasefire that will give time to appropriate and understand the situation that's going on?
So the reason I said Israel reneged was that there was a deal that was agreed that they backed out of. And the way it was supposed to happen was last weekend, they were supposed to sign off on the deal that the Egyptians took to Tel Aviv, got the sign off on, took it to Hamas and tweaked, ran the tweaks by everybody. Hamas agreed to it just before Israel invaded Rafah, and then Israel backed out. That deal had what you might call the big picture overarching parts. So instead of permanent ceasefire, the phrase was the Egyptian phrase, sustainable calm for like a year, something like that, which is a way to end the war without a peace treaty, and then there was supposed to be an agreement in Cairo and then 2 days of technical negotiations. The technical negotiations are about these really, really Byzantine formulas. Things along the lines of a female IDF soldier is swapped for 30 prisoners, but a male IDF soldier or an intelligence officer from Shin Bet or Mossad is swapped for 50 Palestinian prisoners. Don't forget that Sinwar, the head of Hamas militarily, was swapped for 1,000 soldiers. Not him. He was one of the 1,000 that came out for one IDF soldier. When the Galit, the Talit swap several years ago when Sinwar got out. So that's the old ratio, 1,000 to 1. Now we're using 50 to 131 ratios. And then there was this huge mess about how many hostages Israel has killed. I've seen credible assessments of something between 66 and 97 living hostages, and something between 30 and 70 hostages killed by Israeli bombing. We lost track of 4 hostages and their captors again today that were possibly killed by Israeli bombs. So the swaps were also for dead bodies. And there's a long history between Hamas and Israel of keeping dead bodies from either side for up to years and then swapping for prisoners later. So there were all these details. Day 14, X was supposed to happen. Day 16, the details of phase 2 were supposed to, was phase 1 32 days or 6 weeks, was phase 2 10 weeks or 6 weeks, and so there were lots of little details like that they had an agreement on. It's not like that wasn't agreed to, but they just needed to make sure they agreed on the details, like which Palestinian prisoners were coming out. Israel's now using the fact that we never even got to the technical fine-tuning, that they'd already agreed on the formulas and they were going to announce an agreement, but they had to still work out the details, to saying, oh, well, we still don't agree on these details. But That's a ruse because Gallant, the Israeli defense minister, Gantz, and Eisenkot, the two other members of the war cabinet, all wanted the ceasefire, and Netanyahu overruled them because they'd already agreed to it, and because it was enough to get the hostages out, which was something like 66 living hostages, and then the bodies so that they can rest in peace with their family. And instead, we have this horrible thing going on. There's another sort of interesting phrase we've heard lately, like Netanyahu has a choice between Rafah and Riyadh, meaning he could either go into Rafah or he could take the deal from the Saudis to normalize, and then the whole Muslim world would eventually follow Saudi Arabia for normal relations with Israel, have a Palestinian state, happy times. But I still have the sense that Netanyahu never saw it as a Rafah or Riyadh choice. He thinks he can still get both. And that's one of the reasons he left the Israeli negotiating delegation in Cairo on Tuesday and Wednesday, ostensibly to continue to negotiate these details, which we hadn't even gotten to that point, and Hamas had already gone back to Doha, but also to give him a way out under any number of scenarios, including the scenario where Biden just pulls the plug and says, that's it, you're done, as he did in 2021 when, as Jake Sullivan tells the story, the U.S. kept a war to 3 weeks that Israel wanted to go 3 months in Gaza. So all of that to say that the deal's done. Hamas hasn't backed out of what they agreed to yet, but if Rafah gets significantly worse, they will. The U.S. still wants it to happen, but they're waiting for Rafah to unfold a little bit further while the U.S. continues to try to press Israel to stop Rafah. And as long as this doesn't get bad enough or doesn't go long enough, there's a deal already negotiated that can be implemented. I'm happy to share the details with anybody that wants it, but it's about a 25 paragraph summary that I have about all these details. But it's basically sustainable, calm, 3 phases, swaps of living, then swaps of dead, and then a bunch of sort of humanitarian guarantees and a withdrawal of Israeli forces while a new authority takes over.
How is this impacting U.S.-Israel relations? Sort of, is the U.S. getting frustrated? Is there going to be sort of an attempt from the U.S. to push the Israelis out of Gaza, to push Netanyahu out because he's been such a mitigated disaster for the U.S. in the Middle East? What is the short term? What does the long term look like for U.S.-Israel relations at this point?
So a bunch of thoughts, but here's a couple. Number one, U.S.-Israeli relations are an all-time low in my lifetime. I've seen interesting comparisons between 1956, when Eisenhower refused to join with Israel in the war with Egypt, 1981, when Reagan pushed the Israelis particularly hard on a set of issues, 2 Republican presidents, and of course, George H.W. Bush with the settlements, and then 21 when Biden stopped the war. So there's plenty of precedents here of the U.S. pushing Israel. But the relationship's as bad as it ever has been, and I attribute that more to the fact that this is the most right-wing government in Israeli history, and they're very bigoted, very racist, and almost catastrophically bent on making the Gaza and the West Bank unlivable for Palestinians, and that's just what do you do in that circumstance? In terms of Netanyahu, there's 2 ways to end this war and turn the page. One is to go to a ceasefire, and then eventually Netanyahu gets pushed out, and the other way is to push Netanyahu out to get a ceasefire. And there have been discussions with Gantz. There have been at least 2 moments where the Israeli government was approaching collapse, one over the conscription of far-right religious Israelis who don't have to serve in the military, but some volunteer being forced to fight because Israel doesn't have enough troops, and other issues. But one thing's been clear to all the experts since the beginning: the Palestinian political structure will have to change after this war, and the Israeli political structure will have to personnel will have to change after this war in order for things to move forward, because this government isn't serving this Israeli population. In terms of how to get from here to there, the most cynical way to view things is if Israel and the Palestinians continue to refuse to live side by side in peace, even under a ceasefire, then the U.S. has to go into a containment strategy, which they already have. They're sort of containing the Houthis, they're containing Hezbollah, they're containing the pro-Iranian militias in Syria and Iraq, and there's the problems in Jordan and like all the other places, and on the Egyptian border where Egyptian soldiers have been injured by the Israelis, and the peace agreement between Israel and Egypt is in jeopardy right now because of the activities on the Philadelphia corridor, which are in violation of Camp David and the subsequent peace agreements between Israel and Egypt. But containment is just horrible. You know what I mean? Like, it's not a solution. And so what the hope is and what the timelines are is, in situations like this, you can't act slow or you'll by default end up in containment. You have to act fast. And the degree to which the U.S. can push the Palestinians to come up with their, they've already come up with a new technocratic government. We've already changed the Palestinian government. We just haven't changed the president yet. And Israel needs new leadership, and then we need to force them into, to the extent possible, and with the help of the whole world, which wants this to be over with, we have to end it and kind of take charge a little bit. And if I could add one point, you can't keep calling for a two-state solution when you're one of only 9 countries at the UN voting against the Palestinian state, which 142 countries have recognized. So it's probably time for the US to recognize the Palestinian state at the UN and just move forward on that basis, because you need to give the Palestinians some carrots. Because right now, the onslaught, both in the West Bank, where I think 600 have been killed and thousands injured and thousands forced out of their homes, which isn't really being covered, and on the Negev, they just kicked a bunch of families out that were actually serving in the Israeli military, which made no sense, and then what's going, the catastrophe in Gaza. There needs to be some hope, and the way you make hope is take concrete steps that people recognize as an effort, right? So probably recognize the Palestinian state, and then start negotiating the future.
I think the best way to look at it is the U.S. needs to stop flipping the same coin.
Yeah.
One day it's heads, one day it's tails,
Yeah.
but it's the same goddamn coin. So figure it out.
Or stop digging, use the other metaphor.
So, well, Bill, thank you. This was a great discussion, and great as always to dive into it and really get the points that you're covering. And I know you've been doing this on a daily basis
since October 7th.
A lot of interviews, and so great to have your expertise on this.
It was a pleasure as always, and looking forward to talking about something else very soon.
All right. Cheers.
Bye-bye.